So we discussed the problem-solving model, and I think I've sort of given you an idea on how that works and the 5 steps that are involved there. In order to get to the 5th step, we need to engage in steps 4 and 5 what's called a moral reasoning process. That means we have to figure out what's right and what's wrong, and we have to do that within the context of the situation that we find ourselves in. So, for example, if we're, in a community and we are polluting the air beyond the EPA standards, we have got to understand that that's a problem. It creates health issues for the community. And now, how are we going to determine what the resolution is going to be to resolve that issue? Similarly, we could have exactly the same issue, but we are not polluting the air beyond the EPA standards. We are putting some pollutants into the air, but it's not beyond the government standards that the society has given us. It becomes a different issue. So we are going to have to figure out, as we engage each of the different situations, how do we conduct ourselves in this type of situation. So the moral reasoning process, of course, needs moral standards in order to allow you to reason through your solution. So I'm going to discuss some of the standards. They're all written up in the PowerPoints and in the textbook, so you have them all. But I'll just cover some of the key ones in a somewhat general manner. An ethical dilemma starts, of course, with some kind of issue. It's important that you do not confuse a financial issue or a marketing issue with an ethical issue. Even though what is happening may be something that you agree or disagree with, in order for it to be an ethical issue, it's going to have to violate a moral standard that your society holds to be valuable. So this past summer, there was an issue that came up with Ben and Jerry's ice cream, where they decided to not sell the ice cream in parts of Israel. That was their decision. So people asked me, is that ethically okay? Well, I said, they're a business. Every business is entitled to make the decisions that it deems proper for its growth and development. So really that choice, whether to sell Ben and Jerry's ice cream in that particular marketplace, is a marketing decision. And at the end of the day, it governs their profitability. It's not an ethical issue yet, and I'll explain to you how it can change in a few moments. So the result, of course, of that decision was that there was a tremendous boycott of Ben and Jerry's ice cream. I believe a number of the American states banned them from being sold in those states, and a number of big food stores canceled the sale of those products on their shelves. So there was a financial cost to them. So as far as Ben and Jerry are concerned, is they made a political statement into a marketing statement, and then they suffered a political response, which also carried a financial penalty. But in the entire story, it was all about marketing and finance. It's not an ethical issue. Conversely, had Ben and Jerry's been making their ice cream using slave labor, let's say in the Uighur provinces of China, then it becomes an ethical issue, because our society has agreed as a generality that we're against the use of people as slaves. And so making ice cream using slave labor, now that's an ethical issue the company has to confront and figure out how to deal with it. So hopefully you can see the difference. And so what we're going to be talking about is obviously those areas that are moral violations rather than marketing violations. The next thing we have to understand is, of course, when we're looking at at these situations, we're confronted with information. We'll call that information facts. The truth is that there are two kinds of facts. There are facts that are observable data, such as polluting the environment, and I take a measuring device and I can count how many parts per million of your pollutant is going into the air, as opposed to normative facts, which are opinions. Oh, I don't believe that you should be using this particular wood in a fire because there's not a lot of that wood left on the planet. So I don't know, let's say cedar wood. Well, that may be your opinion, but that's not a violation of any EPA law or any standard that we hold as a society. So that becomes an opinion. A very classic story about that is the guy who works for a pharmaceutical company and feels that the pharmaceutical company should not be charging a lot of money for some of the pills that they sell. And he says, it's not fair. There are people who can't afford to pay for these pills. So sitting in that same boardroom at that same executive meeting is the finance VP, and he says, what are you talking about? We have an obligation to protect our company first and foremost. If we've invested $100 million in developing that pill, we've got to recover our investment so we can keep continuing as a business and try to develop other new kinds of pills and do that before the product is copied or imitated by someone. So we need to charge the higher price in order to ensure our existence. So that is going to be what will happen to you if you bring a feeling into a practical business meeting. It's going to get torn apart and shot down. Now, you may be right. It might not be fair that people have to pay more for the drug because the company needs to maintain its financial stability. But that's not the purpose of a company. The purpose of the company, if you want it to exist, is to be able to sustain itself. So now let's take a look and talk about some of the moral standards that we're going to use that are universally applicable. The first one is called core values or virtue ethics, and it's essentially foundational beliefs of the society that you're in. So we're of course going to be talking about North American society. And what do we mean? We're talking about things that reflect good moral character, like truth, honesty, trust, integrity, responsibility, caring. All of these values, moral standards that we have incorporated into our society, as opposed to bad moral characteristics and virtues that we don't want, such as greed or arrogance or deceit, dishonesty, things of that like we don't want. For example, when you invite someone over to your house, you have an implicit assumption that if the person sees a beautiful painting that you have on your wall, that when that person leaves your house, he doesn't go up to the painting, take it off the wall, and walk out of the house with it. We would call that theft. But there's an implicit assumption that the person won't do it. That's an example of a of an ethical behavior that we expect. Now, it's true, once an ethical behavior becomes something that's challenged enough times, we'll put a law in place to protect ourselves. So we'll have a law once he crosses the threshold of your door that's now removed the property from your house, then we'll call it theft and you can get the police involved. Now, if you happen to live in California, and I think now in New York City, if that painting is worth less than $950, don't bother calling the cops because they're not coming. So now I guess it moves back into the realm of ethical behavior because there's no legal protection for you for that painting if it's worth under $950. So that's an example of core values of what we're talking about. You know, giving your word, saying you'll be there and you don't show up. That's something that we frown on. And so those core values, those basic beliefs, integrity, honesty, those are all things that we can incorporate into our argument for whatever option we've chosen. Another moral standard would be relativism. So relativism is essentially comparative ethics. It's using the common behavior of the industry or the society that we're in as a rationalization or a validation of the choice we've made. Now the thing with relativism is that it's relative and it shifts widely over time. So to give you a dramatic example, if you went to the early 1900s, women didn't have the right to vote. So in those days, if you would have brought up the issue of women's right to vote, common behavior in your society would have been, no, they don't have the right to vote, and that's the end of that. Now come 100 years into the future, and all women have the right to vote. It's not even a question. So now, if you had an issue that involved women's right to vote, and you said, no, they don't, you'd be going against the values of your society, and that would not be relativism. The other thing that you have to understand about relativism is it's not a reflection of what your company is doing as a whole, but what your industry or your society is doing as a whole. So here again, if your industry has the tradition of taking customers out for lavish $1,000 dinners, then you can argue from a relativistic perspective that it's okay for you to go out and entertain your customers and attempt to bribe them, obviously, with these expensive dinners. As I mentioned, of course, the problem with relativism is it shifts over time. So decisions that you make that are supported by relativism, you better be real careful that they don't come back to haunt you 5 years or 10 years later. Because that could be when you're at the peak of your career and suddenly all this old news is thrown up in your face and you have no response because it is what you did. The next moral standard is utilitarianism, which I call the accountant's moral standard. Why? Because basically it is trying to measure what is the greatest good for the greatest number. The problem is, how do you measure that? How do you figure out the greatest good for the greatest number? So on a really simple example, you could have two trains. One train with 50 people, another train with 100 people. You only can save one train. So greatest good for the greatest number would tell you save the train with 100 people because that has the greatest number. And therefore the greatest number of lives will be saved. And that would be, according to utilitarianism, an accurate reply. However, what are the conditions? So let's say that the train of 100 people are all inmates from death row, rapists, murderers, child molesters, the worst kind of people from our society. And the train of 50 people are, all your parents. They all went on an outing together. Good people, maybe a train full of scientists or doctors, at the forefront of research. So now what's the greatest good for the greatest number? Oh, we've got to attach now a value to the lives. So if the 100 inmates, each life we say, you know what, 10 grand for a life. So the 100 inmates are worth $100,000. The 50 people, we say $1 million a life, they're worth 50 million. The greatest good for the greatest number is clearly the 50 million. So that's utilitarianism. On the other side of utilitarianism, we have Canteenism. Canteenism is the idealists, it's the philosophers' moral standard, because it says that you have an intrinsic obligation as a human being to act in a moral way and to do good. And Immanuel Kant, who came up with these ideas, said there are three ways of applying this idea. So we'll call them our three moral standards. One of them is called universalizability. Basically, if you're doing something in the short term that's painful, but in the long term is good for society, that's a good thing. For example, not cheating on exams. You may get a good mark in this particular exam, but you're destroying the exam for all the rest of the students, because what the university will do is it'll revamp its examination process, making it harder for students to cheat and creating a particular encumbrance on the future students that are coming along. So although the students who cheat get a good mark in their exam, they create a difficulty for all the future students that are coming along. Usually not a good idea if you're one of the future students. Another aspect of Immanuel Kant was if universalizability doesn't appeal to you, what about putting yourself in the shoes of the person? So if you would like to be cheated, I guess you can rationalize it's okay to cheat. But most people don't like to be cheated. Most people don't like to be lied to. Most people don't want things misrepresented to them so that their decisions are incorrect for them. So if you don't want it done to you, don't do it to them. And finally, Immanuel Kant said, if those two things don't work for you, how about just a simple, basic respect for humanity? Each person has their life that they're living. Let's say they work for you. Let's say we're talking about our employees. It's not that they're just pieces of equipment or machinery that happen to drive to your business every day and serve you for 8 hours. They're a critical component in what makes your business work, because they may interface with your raw materials, they may interface with your customers, they may interface with each other, and it's all important because it makes your company function. So have a little respect for the people that are there. Not only that, but keep in mind that the people that are there and that have been there for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, they've built your profits every one of those 25 years. Have a little respect for that. Now I'm going to tell you, respect is a tough thing in this society. And the reason it's a tough thing in this society is because what you need to have before respect comes into the picture, that Immanuel Kant didn't mention, is gratitude. If you cannot find in your mind reasons to be grateful for what you have, it's going to be virtually impossible for you to find respect, because everything's going to be due. My employees have got to work for me the way they do because otherwise I won't pay them. So it's owed to me. It's nothing special. Um, so that's Canteenism. Moral rights talks about essentially entitlements. And there are two kinds of moral rights that we talk about. There are negative moral rights, which is mostly what's involved in our subject, such as, which mean a negative moral right, by the way, means that I don't do any harm to you. So you can have the right to expect me to provide you with a safe work environment. You can have the right to expect from me as your boss a, a fair remuneration system. Um, the shareholders have a right to profitability. The employees, again, an environment that has health, that is healthy, without pollutants throughout the entire business. um, so those are moral rights, and again, they're pretty straightforward. Of course, the problem is what trumps what. I have a negative moral right to health and safety. You have a negative moral right to profitability. What justifies me getting the moral right versus you? We have a problem. And finally, we have justice, which is essentially, the consequences for the actions that we've done. They're covered pretty well in the PowerPoint, so I'll just leave that there. And